What ego death actually feels like. What if I told you that ego death, the experience mystics and psychonauts describe as the dissolution of self, isn't mystical at all, but a specific, measurable shift in brain network activity that you can understand, recognize, and even cultivate without substances? Your sense of self, the I that feels like it's reading these words, is constructed by a network of brain regions called the default mode network. When this network's activity decreases dramatically, the boundaries that define you as separate from everything else temporarily dissolve. This is ego death. This isn't spiritual bypassing nonsense. This is hard science. Neuroscientists at Imperial College London, Johns Hopkins, and Yale have mapped ego death using fMRI and EEG. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris's research on psychedelics shows that ego dissolution correlates with decreased default mode network connectivity. The experience isn't supernatural, it's your brain temporarily reconfiguring how it processes self-reference. Ancient contemplative traditions describe this state as no self, union with the divine or cosmic consciousness. Buddhist, Ananda, Hindu nirvana, and Sufi, fana, all point to the same neurological event, the temporary suspension of the self-construct. Ego death isn't death of consciousness. It's death of the particular pattern of brain activity that creates the illusion of a separate, continuous self. What remains is awareness without the story of me. I'm about to expose 10 specific phenomenological markers of actual ego death. Not intellectual understanding, but the lived experience. Each sign reveals a different aspect of how it actually feels when the self-construct dissolves, helping you distinguish genuine ego death from mere altered states or conceptual understanding. Your ego isn't what you think it is. Time to understand what its death actually reveals. Part 1. The boundary dissolution experience. Say you normally experience a clear boundary between in here your body, mind, and out there the world. Ego death begins when this boundary becomes permeable, then vanishes entirely. Neuroscientist Gay or Northoff's research on self-boundaries shows they're constructed by your brain's posterior parietal cortex, integrating sensory and proprioceptive data. When this integration disrupts, the felt sense of where you end and not you begins dissolves. This is technique number 1 out of 10, the boundary dissolution experience. During meditation or contemplative practice, observe the boundary between your body and surrounding space for 20 minutes daily over 40 consecutive days. Pay exquisite attention to the sensations defining your body's edge, where skin meets air, where sound enters ears, where vision begins. Notice that the boundary is actually just changing sensations, not a solid line. Question: where exactly does you stop and world begin? Your brain creates self-boundaries by integrating multiple sensory streams into a coherent spatial map. When you investigate this boundary closely, it dissolves into processes. There's no actual line, just your brain's construction. You're experientially discovering that the boundary between self and world is a perceptual convention, not an ontological reality. Studies on body ownership show that the brain's sense of boundary is surprisingly manipulable. It's a construct, not a given. Start investigating your boundaries experientially and watch the solid sense of separation reveal itself as permeable construction rather than fixed reality. Part 2. The narrative self-collapse. Your life story, the coherent narrative of who I am across time, is what most people mean by self. In ego death, this narrative structure completely dissolves. There's no story, no past built into present, no future extending from now. Psychologist Dan McAdams' research on narrative identity shows that your brain's left hemisphere constantly generates autobiographical narratives. Ego death involves the temporary suspension of this narration. The story stops, and there's just immediate experiencing without biographical context. This is technique number 2 out of 10, the narrative self-collapse, for 30 consecutive days. Practice narrative dropping several times daily. Catch yourself telling your life story internally. I'm the kind of person who, given my history, I've always been. Immediately stop the narrative and return to sensory present. Notice how much of your experience is actually story about experience. Document how often you're narrating versus directly experiencing. Your sense of continuous self across time is maintained by constant narrative self-referencing. When this narration stops, the coherent character you believe yourself to be evaporates. You're training the recognition that the story of me is optional, not mandatory, a habit, not a necessity. Research on default mode network shows that self-referential narrative correlates with specific brain activity. Turn off the activity. The narrative stops, start catching and dropping self-narrative, and watch your sense of being a continuous character dissolve into discontinuous present moment experiencing. Part 3. The observer merging phenomenomally. There's you observing your experience, a subject witnessing objects. In ego death, this subject-object split collapses. There's experiencing without an experiencer, seeing without a seer, knowing without a knower. Philosopher Thomas Metzinger's work on the phenomenal self model explains that the sense of being an observer is itself a construction. When this model dissolves, there's no longer anyone having the experience, there's just experience happening. This is technique number 3 out of 10, the observer merging phenomenon. During meditation for 60 consecutive days, minimum 25 minutes daily, investigate, can you find the observer? When you look for the one who's meditating, what do you actually find? Every time you locate the observer, notice that what you found is just another observed object, a thought, sensation, or image. Keep looking for the ultimate observer. Notice it can't be found, only more observed content appears. The observer is a functional fiction your brain creates to organize experience. When you search for it directly, it can't be located because it's a process, not an entity. You're discovering through direct investigation that there's no findable witness, just witnessing occurring. Neuroscience research on self-location shows that the sense of a localized observer correlates with specific brain activity. It's constructed, not inherent. Start searching for the observer and watch it dissolve as unfindable, revealing experience without an experiencer at its center. Part 4. The time collapse recognition. Your normal experience involves past, present, and future as distinct temporal dimensions. In ego death, this temporal structure collapses into an eternal present, not a long present, but presence without temporal extension. Neuroscientist Mark Whitman's research on time perception shows that your brain constructs the sense of time flow through memory, anticipation, and narrative. When these processes suspend, temporal experience radically transforms. This is technique number 4 out of 10, the time collapse recognition, for 45 consecutive days. Practice temporal investigation throughout your day. Ask, where is the past right now? Where is the future right now? Notice that you can only find present moment experience memories or present thoughts about past. Anticipation is present thoughts about future. Neither past nor future exist anywhere except as present mental activity. Spend 10 minutes daily investigating whether time exists beyond thought about time. Your brain creates time sense through neural processes connecting past memory, present sensation, and future prediction. When you look directly at experience, only now exists past and future are conceptual additions to immediate experiencing. You're recognizing that the three-dimensional time you take for granted is largely mental construction. Studies on temporal perception show it's highly constructed. What you experience as objective time flow is brain-generated. Start investigating time directly and watch past and future collapse into present moment experiencing as their constructed nature becomes obvious. Part 5. The meaning evaporation. Everything you normally encounter is saturated with personal meaning and significance. In ego death, this meaning layer completely evaporates. Things are just what they are, without the interpretive overlay of important to me or relates to my story. Psychologist Viktor Frankl distinguished between meaning and experience. Ego death reveals that meaning is something your self-referential mind adds to raw experience. It's not inherent in things themselves. This is technique number 5 out of 10, the meaning evaporation. State for 50 consecutive days. Practice meaning subtraction. Look at objects, people, and situations and deliberately set aside all personal meaning, what they mean to you, your history with them, their significance in your story. See them as they are before your interpretive mind adds meaning layers. Spend 15 minutes daily practicing seeing without personal significance. Notice how different reality appears without your meaning-making mind interpreting everything through self-reference. Your brain's meaning-making constantly relates everything to self, how it affects you, what it means for your story. When this relational processing stops, things appear in their bare suckness without the about me overlay. You're training the capacity to see without the personal meaning filter that normally mediates all perception. Research on default mode network shows it constantly generates self-referential meaning suppress. This network, meaning-making stops. Start practicing meaning subtraction and watch reality appear strangely neutral and fresh when the personal significance layer dissolves. Part 6. The control relinquishment release. You normally feel like you're controlling your actions, choosing your thoughts, directing your life. In ego death, this sense of personal control completely dissolves. Everything happens, but there's no you making it happen. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libet's experiments on free will show that actions initiate before conscious awareness of choosing. Ego death makes viscerally obvious what research suggests. The controller is an illusion created after actions have already been set in motion. This is technique number 6 out of 10, the control relinquishment release for 70 consecutive days. Observe your sense of control moment to moment. Notice thoughts arising. Did you choose the next thought? Notice actions happening. Did you initiate them? Or did they occur and then you claimed ownership? Spend 20 minutes daily investigating. Where's the controller? Can you find the agent supposedly running the show? Notice that events, thoughts, actions, choices simply occur, and then a thought claims I did that. Your brain generates a sense of agency, the feeling of being the author of your actions. This feeling is post hoc, arriving after neural activity has already initiated action. You're discovering through direct observation that the controller is a story told about actions, not the source of actions. Studies on sense of agency show it's a constructed feeling, not an accurate representation of causation. Your brain creates ownership. Retroactively, start observing the controller directly and watch it reveal itself as an after-the-fact story rather than an actual agent. Part 7. The fear dissolution paradox. Ego death terrifies the ego, precisely because it's the ego's death. Yet when it actually occurs, there's no one left to be afraid. The fear exists before dissolution. During dissolution, fear has no subject to exist in. Psychologist Stanislav Grof's research on holotropic states documents this paradox repeatedly. Intense pre-dissolution fear followed by complete peace during dissolution. Fear is the ego's anticipation of its own absence, but when the ego dissolves, fear dissolves with it. This is technique number 7 out of 10, the fear dissolution paradox. When fear of losing yourself arises during practice, it will. Investigate it directly for 90 seconds minimum. Who is afraid? What exactly fears dissolving? Can you locate the self that's supposedly in danger? Notice that the fear itself is just more experience, appearing in awareness, not something happening to awareness. Practice this investigation during 30 instances of self-dissolution fear, over whatever time frame needed. Fear of ego death is the ego's survival mechanism activating. But the ego is a pattern of brain activity, not an entity that can actually die. When you investigate the feared scenario, you discover there's no actual self to lose, just the dissolution of a pattern. You're discovering that the fear protects an illusion. Research on death anxiety shows it's fundamentally about self-discontinuity. The fear that I will cease. Ego death reveals there was no solid I to. Begin with. Start investigating self-dissolution. Fear directly and watch it dissolve as you recognize there's no actual entity in danger. Part 8. The infinite intimacy recognition. 1. The boundary between self and other dissolves. What remains is total intimacy with everything, not emotional closeness, existential non-separation. You don't merge with things. You recognize you are never actually separate. Neuroscientist Zoran Josipovic's research on non-dual awareness shows reduced activity in brain regions that maintain self-world boundaries. This isn't fusion, it's recognition that separation was an illusion maintained by specific neural processing. This is technique number 8 out of 10, the infinite intimacy recognition for 80 consecutive days. Practice boundary investigation with objects and people. Choose something external, a tree, another person, a sound. Notice the apparent separation, then investigate. What creates the separation? Is it spatial distance? Different substance? Where exactly is the boundary? Look directly at the presumed boundary until it becomes unclear where you end and it begins. Practice this for 15 minutes daily with different targets. Your brain creates self, other boundaries through perceptual processing that segregates sensory fields into me and not me. When you investigate these boundaries directly, they dissolve into continuity. There's just experience without the segregation into insider and outsider. You're discovering that separation is perceptual convention, not ontological reality. Studies on minimal phenomenal experience show that the self-world boundary is constructed by specific brain processes. Alter the processes. The boundary dissolves. Start investigating self-other boundaries and watch separation reveal itself as constructed distinction rather than inherent reality. Part 9. The emptiness fullness paradox. Death feels empty and full simultaneously. empty of the familiar self-structure, full of presence, awareness, aliveness. It's not nihilistic void, it's pregnant emptiness teeming with being. Buddhist philosophy's concept of sunyata, emptiness doesn't mean nothingness. It means empty of inherent separate self, yet full of interdependent arising. Neuroscience validates this. Reduced self-referential activity doesn't mean unconsciousness, it means consciousness without the self-narrative. This is technique number 9 out of 10, the emptiness fullness paradox for 100 consecutive days. Practice noticing the space in which experience appears, rather than focusing on thoughts, sensations, or perceptions. Notice the aware space containing them. Ask, what is the nature of awareness itself, empty or full? Notice it's empty of content. It's not any particular experience, yet full of capacity. All experience appears within it. Spend 20 minutes daily investigating awareness rather than content. Ego death reveals awareness itself, which is empty of particular self-characteristics yet full of the capacity for all experience. Your brain's self-referential processing normally obscures this by constantly generating the me story. When that processing quiets, awareness appears as it is empty form that's paradoxically fully present. Research on pure consciousness experiences shows they're characterized by this paradox. Awareness without content, yet more vivid than contentful states. Start investigating awareness itself and watch the paradox emerge, emptiness and fullness as identical rather than opposite. Part 10. The Integration Aftermath Challenge. As something that will blow your mind. Ego death is easier than what comes after integrating the experience, without creating a new spiritual ego that owns having had ego death. Psychologist Jack Kornfield famously said after the ecstasy, the laundry, peak experiences fade, and integration is the real work. Many people experience ego dissolution, then build a spiritual identity around it, recreating ego in spiritual form. This is technique number 10 out of 10, the Integration Aftermath Challenge. If you experience ego death through practice or otherwise, spend 60 minutes within 24 hours writing what dissolved, what remained, what changed permanently versus temporarily. Then for 90 days afterward, notice any tendency to create identity from the experience. I'm someone who experienced ego death. I'm enlightened. I know what others don't. Each time you notice spiritual identity building, recognize its ego reconstructing itself in new form. Document this pattern weekly. The ego is remarkably resilient. It can even claim ownership of ego death, turning liberation into another achievement. True integration means the experience transforms you, without becoming another identity structure you defend. You're preventing the final trap. Spiritual ego studies on post-retreat experiences show that initial insights often get metabolized into new forms of ego integration. Requires vigilance against this. Option. Start monitoring post-experience identity formation and watch yourself. Avoid the trap of building spiritual ego from ego death. Experience. Closing. These 10 markers aren't just descriptions, they're experiential guideposts that reveal what ego death actually feels like beyond the mystical language. You're not seeking an experience to collect. You're recognizing what's revealed when the self-construct temporarily suspends. Boundary dissolution experience shows the constructed nature of self, world separation. Narrative self-collapse reveals continuous identity as story. Observer emergent phenomenon demonstrates experiencing without experiencer. Time collapse recognition exposes temporal structure as mental. Meaning evaporation state shows self-referential interpretation added to raw experience. Control relinquishment release proves agency is post hoc fiction. Fear dissolution paradox shows fear protects an illusion. Infinite intimacy recognition reveals fundamental non-separation. Emptiness fullness paradox demonstrates awareness's nature. Integration aftermath challenge prevents spiritual ego formation. Ancient contemplative traditions map this territory through direct experience. Buddhist psychology detailed the dissolution of self-components. Hindu Advaita described the collapse into pure awareness. Sufi tradition spoke of annihilation in the divine. They all pointed to the same neurological event, temporary. Default mode network disruption revealing what remains when the self-construct suspense. Modern neuroscience confirms their experiential maps with brain imaging.